The Book of Dusk, the velvet darkness of an Oxford night enveloped the ancient city, its spires and domes mere silhouettes against a star-studded sky. Along the banks of the river Thames, known in this world as the Isis, a small boat glided silently through the inky waters. At its helm stood Malcolm Polstead, a boy of 11, his face set in concentration as he navigated the treacherous currents. Malcolm's daemon, Asta, currently in the form of a kingfisher, perched on the bow of the boat, her keen eyes scanning the shoreline. The canoe, lovingly named La Belle Sauvage, had been Malcolm's pride and joy for years. But never had it carried a cargo as precious as tonight's. In the center of the boat, wrapped in blankets and protected from the chill night air, lay a baby. Not just any baby, but one whose very existence had set in motion events that would shake the foundations of worlds. This was Lyra Belacqua, barely 6 months old, and already the subject of prophecies and the target of powerful, dangerous forces. Malcolm's heart raced as he guided La Belle Sauvage through a particularly tricky bend in the river. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder, a storm approaching that threatened to turn their already perilous journey into a nightmare of biblical proportions. "Malcolm," Asta whispered, her voice barely audible over the lapping of water against the boat's hull. "I think we're being followed." Malcolm's grip tightened on the paddle. He didn't dare turn to look, knowing that any sudden movement could upset the delicate balance of the canoe. Instead, he strained his ears, listening for any sound out of place in the night's symphony of rustling leaves and gentle river currents. There it was, the soft splash of another paddle, the creak of wood under strain. Someone was indeed on their trail, and Malcolm had a sickening feeling he knew who it might be. "We need to find a place to hide," he murmured to Asta. "Somewhere off the main river." As if in answer to his plea, Malcolm spotted a small tributary, almost hidden by overhanging willows. With a skilled maneuver that belied his young age, he guided La Belle Sauvage into the narrow channel, the branches of the willows closing behind them like a curtain. Just in time. Moments later, a larger boat passed by their hiding spot, its occupants scanning the riverbanks with flashlights. Malcolm held his breath, one hand protectively over the sleeping Lyra. Asta had transformed into a moth, her wings fluttering silently in the tense air. The search party passed, but Malcolm knew they couldn't stay hidden for long. The storm was getting closer, the wind picking up and carrying with it the scent of rain. They needed to find safer shelter, and soon. As they emerged from their willow sanctuary, the first fat droplets of rain began to fall. Malcolm looked down at baby Lyra, her face peaceful in sleep, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding her. Her daemon, Pantalaimon, was currently a tiny dormouse curled up on her chest. "Don't worry, Lyra," Malcolm whispered, his voice full of a protectiveness that surprised even him. "I'll keep you safe. I promise." With renewed determination, Malcolm steered La Belle Sauvage back into the main current of the Isis. The rain was falling in earnest now, obscuring visibility and making the river's surface choppy. In the distance, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed seconds later by a deafening crack of thunder. Lyra stirred at the noise, her tiny face scrunching up in distress. Malcolm's heart clenched. He knew that a crying baby would only make their situation more precarious. "Che, it's all right," he soothed, awkwardly patting her blanket-wrapped form while trying to maintain control of the canoe. "We'll be safe soon." But even as the words left his mouth, Malcolm knew they might be a lie. The storm was worsening by the minute, the wind howling through the trees and whipping the river into a frenzy. La Belle Sauvage, usually so steady, was being tossed about like a toy in a bathtub. A particularly violent gust of wind nearly capsized them. Malcolm threw his weight to the opposite side, barely managing to keep the canoe upright. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking him to the skin and threatening to drench Lyra as well. "We need to get off the river," Asta cried, her voice almost lost in the storm's fury. Malcolm nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the shoreline for any sign of shelter. And then he saw it, a flicker of light in the darkness, steady and warm. A window, perhaps, or a lantern. Either way, it meant people, and the possibility of safety. With strength born of desperation, Malcolm fought against the current, steering La Belle Sauvage towards the light. Every stroke of the paddle was a battle against nature itself, his young muscles screaming with the effort. But inch by hard-won inch, they drew closer to the shore. As they neared their goal, Malcolm could make out the outline of a building, a small cottage, its windows glowing with welcoming warmth. But between them and potential safety lay a stretch of turbulent water, choked with debris carried downstream by the flood. "We'll never make it through that," Asta said, her voice tinged with despair. Malcolm gritted his teeth. "We have to try. For Lyra." Taking a deep breath, he steered La Belle Sauvage into the maelstrom. Immediately, they were buffeted by swirling currents and battered by floating branches. Malcolm's world narrowed to a pinpoint focus. Dodge this log, avoid that whirlpool. Keep the canoe upright at all costs. A particularly large piece of debris, what looked like part of a wooden dock, came hurtling towards them. Malcolm tried to maneuver around it, but the current was too strong. With a sickening crunch, it collided with La Belle Sauvage. Water began to pour in through the newly formed crack in the canoe's hull. Malcolm's heart raced. They were sinking, and fast. The shore was tantalizingly close, but with each passing second, it seemed to grow further away. In that moment of crisis, Malcolm made a decision. Scooping up Lyra, blankets and all, he held her tight against his chest. "Asta," he called to his daemon, "we're going to have to swim for it." Without waiting for a response, Malcolm plunged into the icy waters of the flood. The shock of cold nearly took his breath away, but he forced himself to start swimming, one arm cradling Lyra above the water, the other fighting against the current. The next few minutes were a blur of struggle and fear. Malcolm's limbs grew heavy, numbed by the cold. More than once he felt himself being pulled under, only to fight his way back to the surface, gasping for air. Through it all, he kept Lyra held high, protecting her from the worst of the flood's fury. Just when Malcolm thought he couldn't go on, his feet touched something solid. With a last surge of energy, he staggered forward. Stumbling onto the muddy bank, he collapsed to his knees, coughing and shivering, but still clutching Lyra tightly. "Hello there," a voice called out, barely audible over the storm. "Are you all right?" Malcolm looked up to see a figure hurrying towards them, lantern in hand. As the light drew closer, he could make out the features of an elderly woman, her face lined with concern. "Please," Malcolm managed to croak out, his voice raw from swallowing river water. "We need help." The woman's eyes widened as she took in the sight before her. A soaked, shivering boy clutching a baby. Without hesitation, she ushered them towards the cottage. Come in quickly. Let's get you warmed up." The interior of the cottage was a haven of warmth and comfort. After the chaos of the storm, a fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The old woman, who introduced herself as Hannah, quickly set about drying them off and wrapping them in warm blankets. As Hannah fussed over them, preparing hot tea and soup, Malcolm finally had a chance to check on Lyra. To his immense relief, she seemed unharmed by their ordeal. Her eyes, a striking pale blue, gazed up at him curiously. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" Malcolm murmured, gently stroking her cheek. Lyra gurgled in response, her tiny hand reaching up to grasp his finger. Hannah returned with steaming mugs of tea. As Malcolm sipped the reviving liquid, she settled into a chair across from them. Her kind eyes filled with questions. "Now then, young man," she said gently, "perhaps you'd like to tell me what brings you and this little one out on such a dreadful night?" Malcolm hesitated. He knew he couldn't reveal the full truth that Lyra was being hunted by forces, both secular and religious, that her very existence was at the center of a prophecy that could change the world. But something in Hannah's gentle demeanor made him want to confide in her. "We're running from some bad people," he said finally. "People who want to hurt Lyra. I promised I'd keep her safe." Hannah nodded slowly, her expression grave. "I see. And these bad people, they're still looking for you?" As if in answer to her question, a loud knock sounded at the door. Malcolm froze, his heart pounding. Asta, now in the form of a trembling mouse, hid in his pocket. Hannah held a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. She moved to the window, peering out cautiously. Her face paled at what she saw. "There are men outside," she whispered. "They don't look friendly." Malcolm's mind raced. They had come so far, endured so much. He couldn't let Lyra fall into the wrong hands now. But what could they do? They were trapped, with nowhere left to run.